Some stories walk through the door of my studio, and you can feel the weight of them before anyone even says a word. It's a heaviness in the air, a tension that's been packed up and carried all the way from their living room to my stage. This was one of those. The email from the parents, Mark and Susan, was a desperate plea painted in broad, familiar strokes. Their daughter, Jenna, 17 years old, had run away from home. They used all the standard language. She was out of control, ungrateful, falling in with the wrong crowd and throwing her future away. They believed she was living with some boy they didn't approve of, and they were here too. In their words, get our daughter back and talk some sense into her. On paper, it was a classic case of teenage rebellion, a story I've dealt with hundreds of times. But my gut, honed by decades of listening to what people don't say, told me this wasn't the real story. The real story is never the one people lead with. The real story is the one they're terrified to tell, even to themselves. When I met Mark and Susan backstage, they were exactly as I pictured. Mark was a man who wore his suit like armor, a firm handshake, a jaw set with the conviction of a father who believes he's done everything right and been repaid with betrayal. Susan was wound tight, a coiled spring of anxiety, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. They presented a united front, a fortress of parental concern. They had their narrative polished. They spoke of a happy home, of providing Jenna with everything she could ever want: good schools, nice clothes, a car on her 16th birthday. Their story was pristine, a manicured lawn of a family life, but manicured lawns often hide things just beneath the surface. Then I met Jenna. She was brought into a separate room, and she wasn't the wild, defiant rebel her parents described. Not at all. There was no anger radiating off her, no arrogance. She was quiet, watchful. She sat with her shoulders hunched, not like a teenager copying an attitude, but like someone trying to make herself smaller, to take up less space in the world. Her eyes, that's what got me. They were old eyes in a young face, filled with a weariness that a 17-year-old has no business knowing. This wasn't a kid who left home for a party. This was a kid who had been carrying a burden. I started off easy with her. Your parents are worried sick, Jenna. They say they don't understand why you left. She just gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her jeans. They wouldn't, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Help me understand then, I said, keeping my tone level. What's really going on here? She wouldn't look at me. It's just better this way, for everyone. Better for who, Jenna? I pressed gently. Because your parents are in agony, and you don't look like you're having the time of your life. So who is this better for? She didn't answer. And in that silence, I knew. I knew the label they had hung on her. Rebellious teen was a misdiagnosis. In a dysfunctional family system, one person is often singled out as the identified patient. They're the one who acts out, the one who breaks the rules, the one who seems to be the source of all the chaos. But more often than not, that person is simply the symptom of a deeper sickness within the family unit. They are the pressure valve releasing the steam from a pot that's been boiling over for years. Jenna wasn't the problem, she was the messenger. And whatever message she was carrying was so toxic, so dangerous to the family's carefully constructed image, that they had to discredit the messenger. They had to make her the villain of the story because the alternative, admitting the truth, was unthinkable. The story they were selling was that Jenna had changed overnight, that their sweet, compliant daughter suddenly became a monster. I've been doing this a long time. People don't just change overnight. Behavior is a language, it's a history, it's a response to a stimulus. Something happened. Something shifted in that house. And her leaving wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of survival. My job was to figure out what she was surviving from. The session hadn't even started, and I already knew the real patient wasn't the girl in the torn jeans. It was the two people in the green room down the hall, the ones so convinced they were the victims. When we went live, the bright lights seemed to amplify the chasm between them. Mark and Susan on one side of me, Jenna on the other, an empty space on the couch between them that felt 1,000 miles wide. I started with the parents. I always do. You have to let people tell their story, the one they've rehearsed in their heads. You give them the rope. Mark took the lead, just as he had backstage. He laid it all out, the private schools, the summer camps, the European vacation last year. He spoke like he was listing assets in a portfolio, evidence of a successful investment in their child. We gave her a life other kids dream of, Dr. Phil. No struggles, no want. All we asked for in return was respect, for her to follow the rules and make smart choices. Susan nodded along, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She was such a good girl, she'd add, her voice trembling slightly. A straight-A student, captain of the debate team. Everyone loved Jenna. They used the past tense as if the daughter they knew was dead. And in a way, to them, she was. The compliant, perfect image they had curated was gone, and they were mourning its loss. They weren't mourning the actual living, breathing girl sitting 10 feet away from them. Okay, let's talk about these rules, I said, leaning forward. What were the big ones in your house? Curfew at 10 on weeknights, midnight on weekends. No negotiation, Mark stated, his voice firm. Homework done the minute she got home. Chores. We expected her to maintain a certain grade point average. We had standards. And what happened when a standard wasn't met? What was the consequence? There would be a discussion, Mark said. Choosing his word carefully, I turned to Jenna. She was still staring at her lap. Jenna, what did a discussion with your dad feel like? She flinched. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it. She didn't answer. Susan jumped in, a nervous energy in her voice. Mark is a strong man, Dr. Phil. He's a leader at his company and he runs our home the same way. He has high expectations because he wants the best for us. You see that? She wasn't just defending him, she was defining the family doctrine. The home was run like a company. Mark was the CEO and the family members were his employees. The currency wasn't love or support, it was performance. The goal wasn't happiness, it was success. And in that kind of system, any sign of weakness, any deviation from the strategic plan is seen as a liability, a threat to the bottom line. So it's a benevolent dictatorship, is that what you're saying, I asked, looking directly at Mark. He bristled. I wouldn't call it that. I'd call it parenting. It's my job to set the course for this family. And if someone wants to steer in a different direction, if your daughter, for example, develops her own ideas about her life, is there room for that on your course? There's a right way and a wrong way to do things, he said, his voice hardening. The armor was back up. Her ideas were leading her down a path to ruin. This was the core of it. The rigid, black and white thinking. There was no room for nuance, no space for the messy, complicated reality of being a teenager trying to figure out who you are. In their world, you were either compliant or defiant, a success or a failure, an asset or a liability. Jenna had been an asset for 16 years. She was the star employee, the one who always exceeded her performance reviews. But then something changed. They blamed it on the boy she started dating, a kid named Leo. According to Mark, he was a loser with no ambition. He wore ripped jeans, worked part-time at a coffee shop, and played in a band. He was everything Mark wasn't. He was the perfect scapegoat. The minute this Leo kid came around, it all went downhill, Mark said, gesturing dismissively. Suddenly, her grades started slipping. She was talking back. She didn't want to have family dinner anymore. He was poisoning her mind against us. I watched Jenna as he spoke. With every word her father said, she seemed to shrink a little more into herself. She was absorbing all of it, all the blame, all the disappointment. She was carrying the weight of their narrative. He wasn't describing his daughter. He was describing a hostile takeover of his most prized asset. He saw Leo not as a teenage romance, but as a corporate rival who was luring away his top talent. The story they told was that they forbade her from seeing Leo. When she defied them, they took away her car keys and her phone. That was the escalation. They tried to tighten their control, and in response, she pushed back harder. The classic power struggle, and it all culminated one night a few months ago when Mark discovered she'd snuck out to see him. I was waiting for her when she came home, Mark said, his voice low and intense. We had the biggest fight of our lives. I told her she had to choose. It was this family, this life we've given her, or that boy. And you know what she did, Dr. Phil? He looked at me, his eyes filled with a righteous anger. She packed a bag, she chose him, she threw it all away for some boy with a guitar and no future. The stage was silent. He had laid out his case. He had painted a clear picture of a good girl gone bad, a loving family betrayed. He sat back, vindicated, waiting for me to validate his story, to turn to Jenna and tell her to wake up and see the error of her ways. But I wasn't looking at him, I was looking at Jenna. And I asked her a very simple question. Jenna, I said, my voice soft. Is that what happened? For the first time, she lifted her head. She looked past her parents, past me, and straight into the camera. There were tears welling in her eyes, but her expression wasn't one of sadness. It was something else. It was resolve. No, she whispered, her voice cracking but clear. That's not what happened at all. The air on the stage went still. You could feel the entire audience lean in. Mark's face, which had been a mask of paternal certainty, began to crack. A flicker of confusion, then a flash of anger. What do you mean? That's not what happened. He demanded, his voice rising. I was there. Are you calling me a liar on national television? Susan reached over and put a hand on his arm, a gesture meant to soothe, but that looked more like she was trying to hold him down. Mark, please, she whispered, then turned to Jenna with a pleading look. Jenna, honey, don't do this. We're here to help you. No, I said, holding up a hand to stop them both. Hold on. You've had your turn. You've laid out your case. Now it's her turn. The rule on my stage is that everyone gets to speak their truth. Let's let her speak. I turned my full attention to Jenna, creating a bubble around the two of us. Jenna, you have the floor. Tell me your story, the real one. She took a shaky breath, her eyes darting toward her parents for a split second, a lifetime of ingrained habit before she forced them back to me. It wasn't about Leo, she started, her voice gaining a bit of strength. I mean, it was, but not the way they think. It wasn't me choosing him over them. What was it then? It was me choosing to breathe, she said. And the simplicity of that statement hit like a punch. For as long as I can remember, my life wasn't my own. It was a project, their project, the Jenna project, and the goal was perfection. She started to describe it. It wasn't a home, it was a boardroom. Every report card was a quarterly review. Every extracurricular activity was chosen based on how it would look on a college application. Family dinners weren't about connecting. They were about her father grilling her on her progress, her mother anxiously monitoring her responses, making sure she gave the right answers. There was no room for a bad day, a wrong answer, a moment of uncertainty. You said a discussion with your dad, I prompted. Tell me about those. Her father shifted in his seat, ready to defend himself, but I shot him a look that told him to stand down. Jenna's gaze went distant. It wasn't a discussion, she said quietly. A discussion is when two people talk and listen. This was a debriefing. He'd sit at his desk in his study, and I'd have to stand in front of him, and he would just list all my failures. The B+ on a history quiz, the second place ribbon in the science fair, the time I forgot to take out the recycling. And with every failure, he'd say the same thing. Is this who you want to be, Jenna? Are you content with mediocrity? He'd talk about how he was building a legacy and how I was a reflection of him, that my failure was his failure. I looked over at Mark. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle throbbing. He wasn't hearing a daughter's pain. He was hearing an employee's complaint, and he was ready to quash it. And what about you, Susan? I asked, turning to the mother. Where were you during these debriefings? Susan twisted the ring on her finger. I wanted them to have a close relationship. I knew Mark was hard on her, but it was because he loves her. He just wants her to have every advantage. That's a dodge, Susan. I said, my voice firm but not unkind. Did you ever step in and say, that's enough, Mark. She's a child, not one of your employees. Back off. Did you ever defend your daughter? Her silence was the answer. In this family system, Mark was the undisputed authority. Susan's job was not to be a partner, but a lieutenant, enforcing the CEO's vision. She was a buffer, but not a protector. She managed the emotional fallout, but she never challenged the source of the pain. Then Jenna brought up Leo again. When I met Leo, she said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time, it was like I saw color for the first time. He didn't ask about my GPA. He asked me what music I liked. He thought my laugh was cool. He saw me. The me that wasn't captain of the debate team or a future Ivy Leaguer. Just me. Leo's family was different. His parents' house was a little messy. They ate dinner in front of the TV sometimes. They argued, they laughed, they were imperfect and real. And they loved their son not for what he did, but for who he was. Being with him and his family wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an education. It showed her what a home could be, what a family could feel like. It showed her that the air in her own home was toxic, that she wasn't breathing. She was suffocating. The escalation didn't happen because she was breaking rules. It happened because she started bringing what she was learning into her own home. She started to question things. She'd offer a different opinion at dinner. She'd say, I don't know. When her father demanded an answer, she stopped being the perfect, compliant daughter. She started becoming a person. And that was the ultimate betrayal in her father's eyes. It was insubordination, the big fight, I said, bringing it back to that final night. Your dad said it was because you snuck out. That's how it started, she confirmed. But it wasn't what it was about. When he confronted me, I didn't just apologize and cry like I used to. I stood up to him. I told him the reason I had to sneak out was because he was trying to control every second of my life. I told him I was suffocating. I watched her as she spoke. This was the breakthrough. She was finally saying the words out loud. And what did he say? Jenna's face crumpled. The resolve gave way to a wave of old pain. He told me I was ungrateful. He said he had sacrificed everything for me, and this is how I repay him. And then he said, the thing that made me leave. She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He looked at me with no emotion in his eyes at all, and he said, "If you can't appreciate the life I've built for you, then maybe you don't deserve to be a part of it." It wasn't an ultimatum, as he'd framed it. It was an eviction notice. It wasn't choose him or us. It was be who I demand you to be, or you are nothing to me. That single sentence hung in the air of the studio. Maybe you don't deserve to be a part of it. That's not a parent disciplining a child. That is a fundamental rejection. That's a transactional valuation of a human being, your own daughter. He wasn't saying her behavior was unacceptable. He was saying she was unacceptable. He had invested in a product, the Jenna Project. And when the product started showing signs of independent thinking, of deviating from the original design, his response was to declare it defective and recall it from the family line. I let the weight of that statement settle. I didn't say a word. I just looked from Jenna, whose tears were now flowing freely, to Mark, whose face was a stony mask. He was trying to project strength, control, but I could see the panic behind his eyes. His carefully constructed narrative, the one where he was the benevolent patriarch and she was the ungrateful rebel, was disintegrating under the bright television lights. He was being exposed, and he didn't know what to do. Susan was falling apart. She was looking at her husband, then at her daughter. A silent, frantic pendulum of distress. Her whole world, the one she had propped up for so long by smoothing things over and pretending not to see, was cracking at the seams. "Mark," I said, my voice calm and measured, "is that what you said to your daughter?" He took a breath, puffing out his chest. The defense mechanism kicked in. "Things were said in the heat of the moment, Dr. Phil. It was a very emotional night. I may have said something I didn't mean, but the point remains. No, no, no." I cut him off, shaking my head. "We're not going to do that. We're not going to gloss over it. We're not going to minimize it with things were said. I'm asking you a direct question. Did you tell your 17-year-old daughter that she didn't deserve to be part of the life you built?" He stared at me, his jaw working. He was cornered. Lying was no longer an option. The entire audience had heard Jenna. Denying it would make him look like a fool. So he took the only other path available to him, justification. She was being disrespectful. She was throwing away everything we had worked for. I needed to make her understand the gravity of her choices. So you decided the best way to do that was to communicate to her that her worth in your eyes, her very place in your family was conditional, that it depended entirely on her obedience, on her compliance with the project. "It's not a project," he snapped, his voice cracking with frustration. "She's my daughter." "Then why don't you act like it?" I fired back, my tone sharpening. Fathers don't put their daughters on performance improvement plans. They don't threaten to fire them from the family. You say you love her, Mark, but what you're describing isn't love. It's ownership, it's control. You love the idea of Jenna, the high-achieving, compliant reflection of your own ambition. The moment a real, authentic, independent young woman started to emerge, you didn't know what to do with her. So you tried to crush her. And when that didn't work, you rejected her. He looked stunned, as if he'd been physically struck. No one had ever spoken to him like this. In his world, he was the one who did the confronting, the one who set the terms. I turned to Susan, and you, Mom, you stood by and watched this happen. You watched your husband emotionally starve your daughter, and you said nothing. Your silence was an endorsement. You co-signed his behavior. You taught Jenna that her emotional well-being was less important than keeping her father happy. You taught her to swallow her pain to keep the peace. Is that the lesson you wanted to teach your little girl? She broke down completely, burying her face in her hands, her sobs shaking her whole body, she wasn't a villain. She was a victim of the same system in a different way. She had bought into Mark's definition of a successful family so completely that she had sacrificed her own voice and her daughter's spirit to maintain it. She was trapped too. This is the moment. This is the pivot point. The point of confrontation is not about yelling or shaming people. It's about holding up a mirror, a big, clear, unforgiving mirror, and forcing them to look at the real picture, not the airbrushed portrait they've been carrying around in their heads. For Mark and Susan, that picture showed two parents who had created a home that was so psychologically and emotionally barren that their daughter had to run away just to find a place where she could breathe. I let them sit with that image. I turned back to Jenna. Her crying had subsided. She was watching her parents, not with anger or triumph, but with a profound sadness. The sadness of a child who finally understands the truth about the people who were supposed to protect her. Jenna, I said gently, you told me something backstage that I think is important. You said your secret wasn't that you left home, it was why you left home. And you said you were afraid to tell them the real reason. Why were you so afraid? She looked at her father, whose face was now ashen. Because, she said, her voice a near whisper, I knew he wouldn't see it as his failure, he'd see it as mine. He'd say I was too weak, too sensitive, not strong enough to handle the pressure. He wouldn't hear that he hurt me. He would only hear that I failed him. She took a ragged breath. And the secret, the real secret, is that for a long time, I believed him. I thought there was something wrong with me. That was the heart of it all, the deepest wound. It wasn't the yelling or the rules or the pressure. It was the insidious, soul-crushing belief that she was fundamentally flawed because she couldn't measure up to an impossible standard. Her running away wasn't just a physical act of leaving a house. It was the first desperate step in trying to escape that belief. Now, here's the part of the show where the audience expects a magic wand. They want me to say the right words, push the right buttons, and have everyone hug it out before the credits roll. They want a neat, tidy resolution. But real life is messy. Deeply ingrained family dynamics, patterns of behavior built over nearly 2 decades, don't just vanish in a 90-minute television taping. The breakthrough on stage is just that, a breaking through the wall of denial. It's the first crack of light in a dark room. It's not the sunrise. The outcome of a story like this hinges on what happens after the confrontation, after the mirror has been held up. Can the people looking in it stand to see their own reflection? Can they acknowledge the truth of what they see? And, more importantly, are they willing to do the excruciatingly hard work to change it? I turned back to Mark. The anger and defensiveness had drained out of him, replaced by a hollowed-out look. He looked lost. His entire operating system for the world, for his family, had just crashed. He saw himself for the first time not as the powerful CEO, but as the man who drove his own daughter away, the man who told his child she didn't deserve to be part of his life. Mark, I said, my voice softer now. The time for confrontation was over. This was about what comes next. You heard your daughter, she believed, because you taught her to believe that she was defective, that her inability to meet your standards of perfection was a flaw in her, not in the standards. You've been trying to build a legacy. Is this the legacy you want? A daughter who feels her worth is conditional and a home she had to escape just to survive? He shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. He couldn't speak. For a man whose words had always been his weapons and his tools of control, silence was a stunning admission of defeat. He had no script for this. I looked at Susan, who had composed herself slightly, wiping her tears with a crumpled tissue. Susan, your daughter needed a mother, an advocate, a protector. And when the emotional danger was coming from inside the house, she needed you most. But you allied with the threat. You chose your husband's comfort over your daughter's well-being. That's a hard truth to swallow. But you have to ask yourself, what is your role going forward? Are you going to continue to be his lieutenant, or are you going to start being her mother? She looked at Jenna, her eyes pleading. I'm so sorry, baby, she whispered. I am so sorry. It was the first authentic, unscripted thing she had said all day. Jenna didn't rush to forgive her. She didn't say, it's okay, Mom, because it wasn't okay. She just watched her taking it in. She was processing years of emotional neglect in a single moment. It's a heavy, heavy lift. This is where you can go one of two ways. Path A is the storybook ending. The parents commit to intensive family therapy. The father learns to replace control with connection, to value his daughter's spirit over her accomplishments. The mother finds her voice and learns to be a true partner and protector. The family slowly, painfully rebuilds on a foundation of honesty and unconditional love. Jenna eventually feels safe enough to return home, not to the old house, but to a new family dynamic that has room for her to be her authentic self. It's possible. I've seen it happen. It's what we all hope for. But there's also path B. And in my line of work, you see path B just as often, if not more. It's the path of reality, the path of human fallibility. On path B, the shock and shame of the public confrontation wears off. Mark goes home, and his ego, his lifelong defense mechanism, starts to rebuild the walls. He might concede that he was a little hard on her, but he'll frame it as coming from a place of love. He'll fall back on the idea that he was just being a father, providing for his family, and that Jenna is too sensitive, influenced by that loser boyfriend. The system will fight to return to its old equilibrium. Susan, accustomed to her role and afraid of rocking the boat further, might try to broker a peace that involves Jenna apologizing for her part in the conflict, essentially invalidating the breakthrough we just had. The core toxicity of the system remains. In that scenario, Jenna's best and healthiest choice is to not go back. Her leaving wasn't the problem. It was the solution. It was the healthiest move she could have made. For her, the outcome isn't about family reconciliation. It's about self-preservation. It's about continuing to build a life for herself, surrounded by people like Leo and his family, who see and value her for who she is. It's about her going to therapy on her own to unpack the years of emotional damage, to unlearn the toxic lesson that her worth is conditional. It's a sadder ending in some ways, but it's also an incredibly powerful and hopeful one. It's the story of a survivor who broke the cycle. So, what happened here? I wish I could give you the fairy tale. We set them up with top-tier family counseling in their hometown. I made it very clear to Mark that this was his last, best chance to have a real relationship with his daughter, and it would require him to fundamentally change how he defined himself as a man and a father. He had to be willing to tear himself down to the studs and rebuild. He nodded. He agreed. People in crisis will often agree to anything. Jenna did not go home with them that day. That was non-negotiable. She was 17, still a minor, so we arranged for her to stay with a trusted aunt who lived a few towns over, a neutral party who could provide a safe harbor while the family did the work. It was a compromise. It gave her space and safety, and it gave the parents a chance to prove they were serious about changing. I followed up with them a few months later. The report was mixed. They were still in therapy, which was a good sign. Mark hadn't dropped out. Susan was reportedly finding more of a voice in the sessions. But Jenna told my producer that the phone calls with her dad were still strained. He was trying to use the new therapy language, talking about I statements and active listening, but she said it felt like he had just learned a new script. The underlying impulse to manage and control her was still there, just dressed in different clothes. He was asking more about her feelings, but it felt like he was checking off boxes on a new kind of performance review. This story doesn't have a clean ending because life doesn't have clean endings. The outcome isn't a single event, it's an ongoing process. Jenna is on her own journey now. She finished high school while living with her aunt. She's working at that coffee shop with Leo, saving money for community college. She's figuring out who she is, separate from the Jenna Project. Her relationship with her parents is a work in progress. It may never be the warm, unconditionally loving relationship she deserves, but it might evolve into something honest, or it might not. The ultimate success of this story isn't measured by whether or not the family is reunited under one roof. It's measured by whether Jenna is free, free to breathe, free to be imperfect, free to define her own worth. And from what I can tell, for the first time in her life, she escaped the boardroom and found her life. And sometimes that's the best outcome you can ask for.